At the point when I was around 11 years of age, my entire family was welcomed to my home for Thanksgiving. My mother welcomed basically her entire family. My sister and her 2 girls came, my auntie, and I think my grandparents visited also. This was a long time back, so I can't exactly recollect who everything was there. I guess the main individual in this story, however, is my auntie. Her child died when I was only a child. I've been told it was pretty awful. On a highway, he was in an accident. As he was escaping his vehicle, an alcoholic driver hit him and killed him. I don't think I at any point had the opportunity to meet him. Yet, regardless of whether I wouldn't recall. However, I have lots of photographs of him. My family probably stayed through the Thanksgiving holiday and into the weekend. Except it was the second evening of my family remaining that my very first paranormal experience occurred. My room was down the lobby from the visitor room, specifically at opposite ends of the hallway. The main individuals in there were my sister and her girls. Everyone else was sleeping either in my mother's room or in the living room. We didn't have an exceptionally huge house. My room was about halfway down the hall from the bathroom. When I first awoke, I had to use the bathroom. I didn't have any idea what time it was, nevertheless, it was most likely around 4 a.m. It was a very early morning. I regularly turned every one of the lights on to go to the washroom, yet my sister left her entryway open, and I didn't need the lobby light to wake them, so I just did without the light. Ordinarily, I would have been unnerved in light of the fact that I detested the dull. However, I felt okay realizing my older sibling was close by. When I tried to open the bathroom door, it slammed shut like someone had pushed it back, maybe an inch or 2. I was extremely befuddled, so I attempted once more. This time the entryway didn't move by any means. Once more, I attempted and put my shoulder to the entryway and pushed energetically. Again, it appeared as though someone was pushing back, but because I was pushing harder, the door remained open for about 5 to 6 inches and was kind of moving back and forth. I don't truly know how to make sense of it. I've depicted it before as playing a game as a youngster with a companion, attempting to push an entryway open or shut while your companion was on the opposite side pushing back. After perhaps 10 seconds of pushing the entryway, it at long last gave. When it opened, it struck the wall behind it. Staggered, however, didn't fall. I looked forward into the bathroom after I had stabilized myself. What I saw was strange, but surprisingly, it didn't scare me. I saw a tall figure. Could make out a head and shoulders right at the roof then. At that point, the rest only sort of streamed into very nearly address the whole way to the floor. It was white and sparkling. I was unable to see any facial highlights or any such thing, simply the shape, white and gleaming. Gazed at it briefly or thereabouts. Then, at that point, I essentially turned the light on. It disappeared, and I continued on ahead and utilized the bathroom. 2 years ago, I just left that house. Prior to that day, and consistently later, the entryway never adhered or was difficult to push open like it was that evening. Another weird thing is obviously my family took lots of photographs during the visit. At the point when we glanced back at them, there were circles. However, just around myself, my sister, her children, and my auntie. I have taken 1 million photographs in that house. It was fresh out of the plastic new when we moved in. The main time circles showed up was this one time with my family there. I recollect one of my auntie dozing, and there were a lot of circles on her. She was covered, like my cousin was holding her. We as a whole believe right up to the present day, it was him. The injury / spirit / heavenly messenger, anything you desire to call it, that I saw, was positive. We simply all have an inclination it was him. We don't have the foggiest idea why. Perhaps we are simply confident. Perhaps I was extremely drowsy and dreaming. However, it felt genuine. For the last, well, perpetually, my mom and I have been going to my uncle's home in country Missouri for Thanksgiving. It's about an hour away from where we live, and my grandparents used to go there as well. My uncle and I share a common feeling about individuals, so he fabricated his home on a rock street that fell off a region parkway on 8 sections of land of no one in sight. Unblemished magnificence, and I love it. It was his ultimate haven, surrounded by forest and a meandering stream behind the house, where he caught worms and grubs for fishing, and I would find turtles. You could see fundamentally every star in presence around evening time, since there was no light contamination, and we could go around as children without any feeling of dread toward criminals or getting hit by a vehicle. Which is the reason, when I was 10 and some irregular dickus fabricated a monster moronic house straightforwardly across the road from my uncle and auntie, the outcome was a negative energy in my uncle's butthole cake-wrap. To say he was pissed would be putting it mildly. And the person across the road, Gerald, was a Goliath douche. His home was huge, and he was continuously parading his new vehicle, his up-and-coming sweetheart, something. And afterward he began, and on Thanksgiving, consistently since I was 12, he would come walking over to my uncle's home, thump on the entryway just before lunch and welcome himself in. My auntie is altogether more prudent than my uncle, who just at any point addressed Gerald in terse 1 or 2 word reactions. Then Gerald would raise, circumventing the table and getting out whatever we were grateful for, basically so he could gloat about how well he was doing. Got 2 new snowmobiles this year, so I can take this model I'm dating out and show her what a genuine Midwest snowfall is. Or on the other hand, just figured out my ledger has fundamentally significantly increased over the most recent 3 months, so I can, without much of a stretch, bear the cost of a gold-plated Shark Tank, or no big deal either way. In addition to the fact that he was a showboater, yet he'd likewise shamed Jim with the way that he had far beyond they did. Even though he may have been a dickhead, I believe my aunt felt sorry for him because the man had no family, and he just always did this, which was awful in Jesus' name. So half a month prior, as we heaped my family into the minivan to head to my auntie and uncle's, my significant other and I kidded about what gibberish Gerald would have this year. As she fastened her belt, she sneered, "Maybe he has a dinosaur." I checked the children's car seats and got in. Nah, he's likely got a goddamn dinosaur amusement park arranged out. My significant other laughed, and we drove, and we showed up. After greeting my aunt and uncle with hugs, the children dashed inside and down to the creek bed. "Hello, folks. Assuming it begins to rain, come in. That rivulet could flood speedy," I yelled after them. The conjecture hadn't called for downpour. However, it had gotten extremely dull and shady rapidly after we'd left the highway, so I would have rather not taken any risks. Smiled and inquired if my uncle had heard from Gerald today after my uncle slapped my back and gave me a hug. He laughed and said, "Sha, don't say his name too loud or he'll show up early." As a matter of fact, his face sort of scrunched up, thinking, he's been covering his windows and pressing his vehicle earlier today. He let Darcy know that he was going on an outing, so we probably won't see him by any means. We went into the living room to have a drink and talk because I couldn't complain. Around early afternoon, when we'd seen nor heard from Gerald, my auntie came in and shrugged, welcoming us to the table for supper. We plumped down, did the standard grateful for clear discourse, and right as my uncle cut up the turkey, there was a thump on the entryway. "It makes perfect sense to while," my child yelled and hurried to the entryway, with me close by. Anticipated Gerald, however, there was a youthful person in a white shirt, dark pants, dark glasses, no coat, and a clipboard. "You should be," he squinted down at his clipboard, "Jerry. I am here to inform you that the contract expires today, November 23, 2017. So if you'll come along with me, we can," I said. "Apologies, I'm not Gerald, I am Mike, yet Gary lives across the road." I looked past the youngster and into the carport. Didn't see a vehicle, so I don't know how he arrived or where he anticipated that Gerald should go with him. Yet it didn't appear to issue, in light of the fact that the youngster plainly didn't trust me. Sir, I can guarantee you that I was informed this generally occurs, and that you were informed the date. You perhaps received an email about it. He pointed to my pocketed phone. I pointed across the no longer gravel, but still shitty road, and rolled my eyes. I'm not Gerald, Bud. He lives in the OLY, WHERHOUSE, But once more he frowned and didn't even look in my direction. Sir, kindly don't make this hard for me. It's my most memorable day. Just shrugged as his face took on a pleading expression. The person you need lives across the road. Presently, if it's not too much trouble, excuse me while I eat my weight in bird with bread in its poop hole. And I shut the entryway. My son smiled at me. Try not to rehash what I just shared with your mom. He shook his head and ran back to the lounge area, and I followed, however, not prior to looking outside at the patio once more, where I saw the person on the telephone, looking sort of mad, checking the house number, and so forth. We began eating, and I saw through the breaking faith glass entryway that it had gotten considerably more unfavorable looking outside. I pondered the geeky fellow, and how he didn't have a coat on. What a nitwit. Blizzards could be somewhat horrendous around here in the colder time of year, to such an extent that I referenced to my significant other that I ought to move the vehicle from the marginally disposed carport. It was on to more even out ground. She concurred, so I headed outside, and saw the youngster was no more. Great, I said without holding back, accepting he at long last got it straight, and went to mess with Gerald. The breeze selected up as I got from the van, almost pushing the entryway shut on my lower leg, and the mist became even hazier. I ran inside, snatched my glass of wine, and put down to screw up some cranberry sauce. The initial not many tinks of something raising a ruckus around town made me turn upward. Beautiful hail. I thought, however, at that point I saw the hail was moving. I went to the window and peered down on the deck. What is it, honey? My significant other inquired. I wasn't sure, yet I muttered it's not hail, bugs. They're bugs. Also, they were countless insects hitting each window yet not splatting, and afterward amassing the ground outside. My children were justifiably gone crazy and intrigued simultaneously, and the grown-ups traded looks of stress, tempered by liquor. We kept eating, and afterward one more thump on the entryway punctured the quiet of Thanksgiving supper and the tireless drumming of creepy crawlies pouring down. I got up and the thumping developed more relentless. I pulled the entryway open, and there was the youngster once more, looking priggish yet upset, clipboard next to him. All set, Jerry? He inquired. I scoffed and shut the entryway all over. The beetle stopped when I sat down, and I could hear him sigh as he picked up the phone again. Well, that is great, I said. My children, uncle and auntie were peering through the window, however, focused on the tree line, and my better half looked stressed. What's happening? I inquired. Because of the way the trees were moving, I assumed that the wind had picked up significantly. To put my nose against the glass and noticed, and my auntie opened the window close to my seat. We all listened to something that was neither silence nor wind. My uncle ventured out onto the deck, keeping away from bugs as he could, and turned around to us, his face pale. There's no wind. The trees are shaking, like shaking in the ground, vibrating. The sky developed more obscure, and as my uncle lifted his eyebrow in a whiff shift focus over to us all, the rivulet bed where my children had been playing scarcely 2 hours before yawned open, the sound something like thunder and falling rocks. Dim shapes amassed around the 7-foot-long gap, and I got my uncle and pulled him inside. All at once, as the amassing haziness blended into ambiguously humanoid shapes and started to climb the slope to the house, The thumping at the front entryway fired up once more. "Jerry, you really want to respect the agreement. Accompany me now," the youngster yelled, sort of noisy, however, with a new tone of threat that wasn't there previously. The trees started shaking all the more fiercely, the shapes getting closer, and house loaded up with tormented murmurs. My children were shouting, crying, and my uncle, tracker he is, ran into his nuke, opened his weapons safe, and got a few for us. The thumping proceeded, and from down in the storm cellar, a sound like a demolition hammer hitting a sheet of tin fired up, adding one more degree of dread to the chaos that encompassed us. Gerld, Gerld, Gerld. I continued to hear from the front until my uncle, eye jerking, recently snapped. He stacked up his shotgun, bluntly strolled to the front entryway, opened it up, and wrecked the person, weapon pointed under his jawline. "I'm not Gerald Skinner. Gerald Skinner lives across the road at 126 Clark Street. This is 12. He pivoted to his location, where the 9 had rearranged to a 6 from a free nail. He stood up, slapped his hand on the 6, turned it around, and glanced back at the person. 129. This is 129. Poophole. What tone was left in the man's face depleted, and he mixed to get his telephone out, shackily settling on a decision, and running down the carport quickly. Perhaps 30 seconds after the fact, everything halted, the insects were gone. The trees were still, and the spring looked typical. The sky was as yet dull. However, it was nearly winter, so no big deal either way. As if we had all been holding our breath for the past 5 minutes, we all kind of exhaled simultaneously as we sat down in the living room where our legs gave out. I held my child and my better half held our little girl, and my auntie was wailing. My uncle actually looked pissed, significantly more so when after only a couple of moments' relief. There was one more thump at the entryway. When I opened it, I expected to see the nerdy guy once more, but instead I saw a nice old man in a suit that was perfectly tailored. He grinned a grin that was immense and phony, and messy but conveyed outright earnestness simultaneously. "Great day. Sorry about that awful interference to your Thanksgiving supper. Understudies, haha," he expressed, sort of elbowing my ribs tenderly. I giggled and gestured, as though I needed to manage understudies every day. We were looking for Mr. Skinner, and well, you know how it goes. Little misunderstandings, haha. He got some distance from me, and caught his hands behind his back, looking across the road at Gerald's home. "At any rate, for what reason do you need that person? He's sort of a prick," I said. The man laughed, yet his face turned out to be very difficult. Mr. Skinner signed a contract with our business on Thanksgiving Day 20 years ago. We thought, after we'd mistakenly recognized this house as his, that he was basically attempting to escape our arrangement. He tapped his foot to a cadence that I was unable to hear. He was odd, this little elderly person. And afterward he proceeded. "They quite often attempt to escape the agreement, yet none have at any point been basically as resolute as you were, and that combined with the new person, it's all been a wreck, so once more, we apologize for the bother." He kind of glanced back at us, and we as a whole mumbled something like, "No problem." I looked across the road and saw Gerald madly yelling at the understudy, whose dissatisfaction I could yell as far as possible on our patio. We looked as Gerald ran inside, and the understudy settled on a telephone decision. Dull shapes sprung up in the reaped corn handles by and large around Gerald's home, moving gradually towards his yard. I could see the sides of the elderly person's mouth climb, showing a grin that I realized I presumably didn't have any desire to see. The windows and tires of Gerald's new Hummer detonated outward, and we could hear him endlessly shout. "So, can we eat here?" inquired. "I don't have any idea," I asked. However, it seemed like I ought to presumably. "Gracious goodness indeed, obviously," he said, signaling us away. "However, the Beatles will be missed. We went inside to be thankful that our house was where it was and not in the Dali-like landscape across the road, shaking our heads in agreement. As I shut the entryway, I heard the elderly person share with himself, "Truly do cherish the scarabs." At the grocery store, don't argue over the last Thanksgiving turkey. It's not worth your day-to-day's life. I needed to stay there and watch my grandma strip back the skin on her own hand, plunge it, crude tissue uncovered, into a bowl of hot sauce, and take a chomp. Her teeth couldn't get through the fingers. Her jaw was excessively feeble. She stayed there, chomping pointlessly, while sauce and blood trickled down her jawline. She was powerless and couldn't stop herself, unfit to complete her feast, caught in the detestable activity, similar to some wrecked robot. The satanic soul's impugning had deadened every one of us, and my unfortunate grandmother, 74 years of age, was quick to be compelled to play out an unbelievable demonstration of self-mutilation. Her substantial independence was in a moment taken from her, unceremoniously revoked by the same unquestionable power that had joined my parents' bodies into an unholy union of battered flesh after telekinetically brutalizing them. While sitting across from me and next to his wife, my grandfather wept as he watched her, and afterward at the snap of our abuser's fingers he turned, put his own hand on his plate, and grasped his blade with his other hand. I automatically shouted out, not having any desire to see him pitifully headed to self-hurt. He gazed toward me, a demeanor of unadulterated ghastliness all over, and I cried straightforwardly, boisterously, "I told you, in the event that you utter a sound, you'll be compelled to skirt your dinner and go directly to dessert. No meat for you." The thing with two awfully combined heads, what had once been my mom and father, independently limped toward me, thumping dishes and glasses from the table. It chanced upon a seat that had been pulled out from underneath the table hours prior, my sibling's seat, and crushed it with a knob-ridden arm. My skin was pierced by the inevitable shrapnel of wood fragments that flew in the air. Just faintly felt the agony. Whatever the paralytic component was, it also had a numbing effect. The swaying ghastliness came to stand clumsily close to me, squeezed straight facing my shoulder, and I felt its body pulsate and throb convulsively. Heard its conjoined hearts thump arrhythmically, smelled the offal of its horrifyingly uncovered, heedlessly ensnared stomach-related frameworks. Blood and bile dribbled from its worn-out clothing. Might it be said that you are prepared for your treat? You deserve it, with that little explosion of yours. Venturing into the hole between my mom's collapsed bosom and my dad's destroyed pectoral, it took out a cluster of sludge, some dreadful, bile-like discharge. It respected the green stuff for a couple of seconds, my mom's eyes shimmering in the radiance of the oddly glistening goop as it lifted her hand above me. The slime was then forced into my face and dropped onto my plate with a cackle that was filled with phlegm. The smell and the little taste of it I got were both horrendous. Yet the most awful part was the vibe of the ooze all over. It consumed, not really with regards to temperature, but rather causticity. It was horrendously harsh. As I attempted to inhale, I felt it begin to consume the skin of my cheeks. Fortunately, I'd instinctually shut my eyes after landing. Otherwise, I'm certain I would have lost my sight. Right when I assumed I planned to kick the bucket, suffocated in a shallow pool of destructive ooze, the tension on the rear of my head was feeling significantly better, and I darted up standing, heaving for air. Naturally, I shook my face, frantically expecting to get the sludge off me. I possibly quit whipping my face to and fro when I heard my grandma shout in desolation. Turning, I expected to track down her chomping on her hand, feeling that she'd at last nibbled through her fingers. I'd rather found her face softening, the muscle previously offering to bone as the corrosive dealt with her old, defectively consumed skin. It just required a couple of moments for her to bite the dust. My grandfather stared, speechless from the event. I let completely go, became crazy. I cried, beseeched her to awaken, to take a gander at me, even as her softened eyeball began to trickle from the burning hot attachment. The thing left, walked back to the top of the table, where it plunked down and emulated eating. There was nothing on the plate before it. It got a fork with my mother's hand, a blade with both of my dad's. They were too powerless exclusively to be of any utilization, and cut and wounded at the non-existent dinner. Supper went on like that for basically 1 more hour, me going through periods of intense hysteria and insensate silence, my granddad gazing, the thing removing vast parts from its vacant plate. All at the point when the doorbell rang, it stood, applauded its hands together, and said, "Goodness, that should be your sibling. I'll get him." That took me back to mindfulness, back to that angering reality. My sibling had recently had his most memorable youngster. He and his life partner were so glad to have begun a family together. I realized that I was unable to allow this thing to hurt him, couldn't allow my sibling to be detracted from his prospective spouse and delightful child. Some way or another, I defeated the spell or poison of loss of motion, probably as a result of the mixture of anxiety and accumulated adrenaline. I stood, went around the table, and with the blade I'd evidently snatched en route, held onto hold of my dad and cut him in the head. The edge sank into his skull effectively, way too effectively, and a greenish-yellow pus flooded out rather than blood. The repulsiveness pivoted, and my mom's face grinned mischievously. "That one's been dead for a really long time. You were unable to tell." I was sent flying across the lounge area, into the cupboard where the extravagant plates, many currently crushed to bits, were kept beyond occasions. The effect took the breath out of me, and I arrived on the floor hard, in confounding torment. Shards of glass, the sheets from the entryways, fell onto me, and I almost had my jugular cut by an especially enormous section, groveling on the floor, with my hands behind schedule covering my neck and face. I paid attention to the frightfulness, ungraceful strides as it went to the front entryway. I heard the entryway open, and afterward my siblings' shout filled the house. Disregarding the shards of glass, I crept toward the corridor that prompted the front of the house. Heard hints of battling, and afterward my siblings shouted once more, just this time it was a lot more fragile, articulated with huge torment, and oddly suppressed. This rushed my development a bit, in spite of the fact that my ribs and shoulder throbbed excruciatingly, something without a doubt swollen or even broken. Justing the corner, I came into the corridor and saw a sight of uncommon foulness. My brother was completely consumed by the horror of his parents. My siblings' legs hung from the animal's vast chest depression. Blood splattered from my mother's prematurely placed nativity scene onto the freshly vacuumed carpet, the hall walls, and the perfectly polished table where the feet kicked helplessly. His lamentable shout was unfortunately cut off by a boisterous mash, as the jaws of the frightfulness chest depression, the distorted, mortally bended rib confine, shut firmly upon his own, quickly killing him. With a wet thud, his bisected lower half fell to the ground, blasted moronic by the sheer terribleness of his demise. I could look as his upper half was bitten and gulped by the gigantic jaws. However, the awful scene did not end there. The exposed internals of my brother's body forced me to observe its digestion. Frozen, I watched the digestion tracts and stomach enlarge as the chewed and corrosive liquefied remains flowed through the horribly amalgamated viscera of my mom and father. At long last, again gathering up some leftover self-discipline, I shut my eyes and dismissed, wouldn't watch the last not many unwholesome snapshots of the unthinkably quick cycle. The occasions after that occurred in a fantasy-like shock, and I presently think of it as a leniency that I was saved, through my shock-prompted ridiculousness. The homicide of my granddad. Assuming he shouted or called out for my assistance. Didn't hear, drooped against the corridor table, lying on my arms, I trusted that demise will come to me, seen with unquestionably the dimmest mindfulness the consummation of my granddad's life. Heard the apparently far away and inconceivably evil yelling and chortling of that body-taking and tissue-eating devil. The thing came back to the hallway after what seemed like minutes or hours, and I was carried up by my neck. Easily. It held me up so my face was level with my dead dad's, and talking through the hanging lips in a corrupted presentation of puppetry. It said, "One should stay to bear the culpability of what this family has done. You denied me of my Thanksgiving. Thus I've denied you of yours. Live, and always remember what occurred here." Furthermore, despite the fact that I was investigating my dad's coded, unseeing eyes, I saw behind them a natural presence. A picture of somebody I'd as of late met. Affected to look further, I looked profoundly into the dead eyes, and finally saw him. Prior in the day, my mother and I were at the supermarket, and that is where we experienced the man in odd, old-fashioned clothing, with a thick, unattractive facial hair and hard, bruised eyes. The person who swore at us. Initially, I hadn't moved toward visiting, yet my father, after a long telephone discussion, during which I was paid off with homemade cheesecake, persuaded me to join in. He'd previously done likewise for my sibling, who additionally hadn't moved toward visiting. Thus, with 3 additional mouths to take care of, my sibling's child left with his life partner's folks. My mom chose to purchase a greater turkey, giving the one she previously purchased to a foundation. Earlier today, she and I went to the supermarket and figured out how to catch the last turkey they had. A tremendous bird, which they brought out from the back, where it had some way or another stayed inconspicuous for quite a long time. It was a fortunate find for us, lucky, at least for the time being. The peculiarly dressed man, who'd likewise gone briefly turkey run, offered us cash for the turkey, yet we declined, and made sense of our off-the-cuff need for it. He became irritated, said a few unrepeatable, frightfully melodious things, then, at that point, stomped off. We just accepted he was insane. Unpredictable was my mother's assertion, and obliged our day. Choking under the grasp of my mother's colossally proportioned hand, I attempted to apologize, despite the fact that I hadn't done anything morally off base. Be that as it may, the insane man who had some way or another found us and laid a revile upon us, wouldn't tune in. At the point when I thought I'd stifle to death, the second time that evening, it raised back and pummeled me against the lobby table, crushing the little puppets, and afterward passed on me to lie among the pieces. I witnessed the pathetic body collapse in a landslide of organs and flesh before I passed out from the shock and pain. What's more, as it fell to pieces, it let out a long, crazy, blackly remarkable cry. That was last Thanksgiving. Evidently, I was the sole survivor. I've recuperated from my wounds, yet haven't recuperated from the mental injury. However, it is a brand new year and Thanksgiving, and I am spending it with the child of my brother and her grandparents, my only remaining family. I have a couple of somewhat late things to snatch from the supermarket, and afterward all that will be prepared. What could turn out badly?